there, monster maniacs. It's Heidi from Channeling Spirits. Mummies. Unlike other creatures, mummies are actually real.
Mummies are real. There are mummies at museums.
Why on earth would a museum put a mummy in it?
But the idea of an undead Egyptian arising with a curse, covered in bandages and arms outstretched, is a relatively new phenomena. To arrive at our modern idea of the mummy as a monster, we have to go through the history of mummification, European discovery, and pop culture. When Arabs first encountered mummified bodies, the dark appearance led them to believe they were prepared with mum, the Persian word for bitumen. Therefore, the bodies preserved with mum were called mummia, which became mummy in English. Ancient Egyptians believed the soul of a person had several components, including the ba, which was the personality or everything that made an individual unique, and ka, or the vital essence of a person. In order for these two aspects to have a chance to be judged by the guardians of the afterlife, the khet, or physical form, had to be preserved. In the Old Kingdom, only pharaohs had the means of attaining this afterlife. But by the Middle Kingdom, there were several options for preservation. Based on Herodotus's reports and modern science, we have a good understanding of the most perfect mummification process. The heart was believed to be the center of reason, so the brain served no purpose. Herodotus claimed an iron hook was used to pull out the gray matter.
First thing the embalmers did was to stick a metal hook up his nose, and they dragged his brain out through his nostrils.
But modern scientists believe a rod was instead inserted through the nose to liquefy the brain, and it was drained out by gravity. The embalmers then made an incision along the flank and removed the internal organs, except for the heart.
The usual scar made by the embalmer's knife is not there.
Organs were placed in canopic jars with the 4 sons of Horus.
Let me get this straight. They ripped out your guts and they stuffed them in jars.
The cavity was then rinsed with palm wine and herbs. The body was further dehydrated by natron for 70 days. It would then be washed again and wrapped in the linen bandages. The bandages were covered in gum and returned to the family. So how did a burial process captivate the imagination of a continent? Europe has had a long interest in Egypt, but the modern fascination started with Napoleon's invasion. The British captured Egypt from the French in 1801 and took many spoils, including the Rosetta Stone. Europeans began to collect these stolen artifacts, including mummies, with which they would host unwrapping parties.
Oh, you can unwrap it?
Why not? All you're looking at is 3,000 years of dry rot.
While Mary Shelley would go to describe her reanimated monster like a mummy twice, it would be years later before a novel was written about an Egyptian mummy. Jane Loudon's 1827 novel, The Mummy, A Tale of the 22nd Century, is the first story featuring a resurrected mummy, Pharaoh Cheops. But rather than taking place in present day, Cheops is brought back in the year 2126. Like Frankenstein, science is initially attributed to the mummy's resuscitation with a galvanic battery.
I have long been convinced that where the nervous system remained uninjured and the appearance of death was only occasioned by a suspension of the operation of the animal functions, that life might be restored. If, by the intervention of any powerful agency, the nervous system could be excited to reaction, and as this, of course, could not be effected when any kind of decomposition had taken place, it appeared to me that a mummy was the only body upon which the experiment could be tried with the least prospect of success.
But the ending leaves Cheops' reanimation to be possibly more mystical.
Was it a human power that dragged you from the tomb? The power that gave me life could alone restore it, replied the mummy.
This theme of more supernatural reanimations rather than scientific would eventually become the norm. Cheops is also described with monstrous descriptions. He is a great tall figure with great flaming eyes and bony fingers. He is wrapped in folds of red and white linen, every finger and even every toe distinct.
The dried, distorted features of the mummy looked yet more hideous than before when animated by human passions, and his deep, hollow voice, speaking in a language he did not understand, fell heavily upon his ear like the groans of fiends.
Loudon's The Mummy may have also inspired the 1932 scene of explorers in a tomb who suddenly find themselves baffled that a reanimated mummy has vanished.
He went for a little walk. You should have seen his face.
But unlike Frankenstein's creation, Cheops is not rejected, nor is the story a cautionary tale. The mummy as a monstrous creature would come sometime later. In fact, the mummy was more commonly a romantic figure, such as the 1840 short story The Mummy's Foot by Theophild Gottier. The unnamed protagonist enters a warehouse of bric-a-bracs looking for a unique item. He discovers a mummy's foot.
It's a mummy's foot.
The foot of Princess Hermonthis, which he decides to purchase as a paperweight.
Some of the guys use them as paperweights.
He is eventually transported by dream or supernatural means to ancient Egypt. Unlike Cheops' terrifying visage, Hermonthis possessed the purest Egyptian type of perfect beauty. Her eyes were almond-shaped and oblique, with eyebrows so black they seemed blue. Her nose was exquisitely chiseled. Ultimately, it is never confirmed if the protagonist dreamed of traveling to ancient Egypt, but the mummy's foot is mysteriously gone.
Peter, where have you been?
In 1845, Edgar Allan Poe would have his own tale of a mummy, although devoid of terror and wrapped with satire. Remember the unwrapping parties we mentioned?
Have you no respect for the dead?
Poe's Some Words with a Mummy sets his story at such a gathering. Like Loudon, galvanic electricity is used to reanimate the mummy, but more for the means of satire. This should be obvious from the mummy being named Alla Mis Steko, or rather, Alla Mistako. It's hard to say if Poe's commentary on Egypt mania properly criticized the problem of colonial theft or brought more interest to the mummy craze. However, the notion of innocent explorers raiding ancient tombs was quickly shifting. In 1869, Louisa May Alcott wrote Lost in a Pyramid, or The Mummy's Curse, introducing just that.
Curse my ass.
Yeah, who cares?
After returning from Egypt, an explorer explains to his fiancée Evelyn how he came to possess a golden box with scarlet seeds taken from a mummified sorceress. When Evelyn plants the seeds, the curse that had bided its time for ages was fulfilled at last, and her own hand wrecked her happiness forever. Death in life was her doom. While literary curses were a matter of fiction, in 1922 they became real, or so it seemed. With the unearthing of Tutankhamun's tomb, or King Tut,
how'd you get so funky?
Was supposedly cursed. This curse was more a media sensation, with misfortunes happening to Howard Carter, the archaeologist behind the excavation.
Come, Dr. Miller, surely a few thousand years in the earth would take the mumbo-jumbo off any old curse.
It's a curse. It's a curse.
The curse! Beware of the curse!
Regardless, there was a renewed interest in Egyptology. Myself included, loved it since I was a kid. Following the success of 2 literary classics in 1931, Universal Studios was eager for another horror adaptation. Though no direct adaptation existed, one story, The Ring of Thoth, by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, was clearly the main influence.
You must not read from the book!
Sasra is trying to rejoin his mummified love, Atma. He attained immortality by injecting an elixir into his blood.
Suffice it that their result was to furnish me with a substance which, when injected into the blood, would endow the body with the strength to resist the effects of time, of violence, or of disease. It would not indeed confer immortality, but its potency would endure for many thousands of years.
But rather than trying to revive his lost love, he seeks the titular ring of Thoth to end his immortality. The mummy concept was handed over to John L. Balderston, who not only contributed to writing Dracula and Frankenstein, but also covered the opening of King Tut's tomb for the New York World.
But I think it's a national disgrace the way we have commercialized it with trinkets and toys, t-shirts and posters.
Sasra became Imhotep.
Imhotep. High priest of the Temple of the Sun at Karnak.
Who was a real-life high priest who may have been the architect of Djoser's Step Pyramid. But rather than an elixir, Imhotep was cursed and brought back by reading from the Scroll of Thoth.
And I believe that you have in your hut the Scroll of Thoth itself, which contains the great spell by which Isis raised Osiris from the dead.
Most remember Boris Karloff as the bandaged mummy in the film, which took makeup artist Jack Pierce 8 hours to apply. Karloff filmed for 5 hours until 2 a.m., and it took another 2 hours to remove it. He only appears as the iconic bandaged mummy for 3 minutes and 52 seconds, mostly in the background. Imhotep pursues a woman he believes to be his reincarnated lover, Anck-su-namun. Anck-su-namun was actually the wife and half-sister of King Tut.
The ladies love this style.
Before Imhotep can mummify her, she prays to Isis, who destroys the Scroll of Thoth and ends his immortality. Imhotep is more a tragic figure than a monster, but the mummy as a mindless creature would come not only in the Universal Studios sequels, but was inspired from another Sir Arthur Conan Doyle story. In 1892, Doyle wrote Lot number 249.
That lot 249 was a heavy mother.
Edward Bellingham is a student at Oxford and a fanatic for all things Egyptian. Me too. He purchases a mummy at an auction and discovers a way not only to reanimate it, but also to use it to eliminate any perceived threats. This mummy is described in classic Gothic style.
The features, though horribly discolored, were perfect, and 2 little nut-like eyes still lurked in the depths of the black hollow sockets. The blotched skin was drawn tightly from bone to bone, and a tangled wrap of black, coarse hair fell over the ears. 2 thin teeth like those of a rat overlaid the shriveled lower lip. The gaunt ribs, with their parchment-like covering, were exposed, and the sunken, leaden-hued abdomen with the long slit where the embalmer had left his mark. But the lower limbs were wrapped around with coarse yellow bandages.
Mummies had been reanimated and romantic, but this was the first time a mummy was a mindless monster to be controlled. When it came time to make a sequel in 1940, they chose a new mummy, Charis. In the mummy's hand, Charis would also become a murderous creature bound by his master's whims. Lot number 249 doesn't go into exact detail on how the mummy is resurrected, but it suggests that a roll of papyrus and dried palmate leaves from a palm-like plant might have something to do with it. In the mummy's hand, Charis can only be revived by the fictitious tanna leaves.
Tanna leaves
A brew of 3 tanna leaves
will make enough fluid to keep Charis' heart beating. Once each night, during the cycle of the full moon, you would dissolve 3 tanna leaves and give the fluid to Charis.
While the classic mummy is often shown with an immobilized arm in a sling, it comes from the mummy's hand only because Charis is not at full strength.
Only I can tell you where you will find the fluid that gives you life. You would like to have the use of that leg and that arm.
The mummy became associated with other slow-moving undead. 2 years later, a blind Frankenstein's monster would also lumber with his arms stretched out, but his trope actually dates back to 1920. The cabinet of Dr. Caligari began the classic act of having someone sleepwalking with their arms out. This became shorthand for those possessed or hypnotized. In 1959, Hammer Productions would use Charis, the star of 4 Universal Mummy films, for their reboot. Their film took elements from several Mummy films, but largely The Mummy's Ghost. A priest with the last name of Bey orders Charis to kill. The reincarnation of Princess Ananka enamors the mummy, who carries her into the swamp at the end. In 1980, The Awakening was released, which was inspired by Bram Stoker's 1903 horror, The Jewel of the Seven Stars. If Stoker's name sounds familiar, it should. He wrote Dracula. In the novel, Malcolm Ross has been called to observe an Egyptologist, Abel Trelawney, who is unconscious. Years ago, he uncovered the mummy of an Egyptian queen named Tara. During that time, his wife died during childbirth, but his daughter Margaret survived. Queen Tara's spirit has been possessing Margaret. A great experiment results in Tara reincarnating into Margaret and few surviving. The Awakening oddly swaps Tara for Kara.
The nameless one must be forever alone.
Abel Trelawney is now Matthew Corbick that has an expectant wife who has a stillbirth. Opening the tomb of Queen Kara restores his stillborn daughter, Margaret, to life. 18 years later, Corbick believes his daughter has been possessed by Queen Kara, and the only way to rid her is through a ritual over the mummy. It ends as dark as the novel. Anne Rice, famous for her Vampire Chronicles series, merged the romantic and the monstrous mummy in her 1989 book, The Mummy, or Ramses the Damned. In a fascinating reversal of the vampire, her mummy requires sunlight and has an insatiable desire for food and drink without needing them.
Another local peasant has been found dead, drained of his blood with 2 teeth marks on his throat.
We think we're dealing with a supernatural being, most likely a mummy.
Then, in 1999, Universal Studios remade their classic hit. Once again, Imhotep. A high priest is buried alive.
Buried alive?
This man was buried alive.
But rather than using the Scroll of Thoth to revive Anck-su-namun,
they broke in upon me and found me doing an unholy thing.
The high priest and the pharaoh's mistress are defiant in their love. Instead, Anck-su-namun's body is taken to Hamunaptra. Like the original, Imhotep commits a sacrilege.
For his love, Imhotep dared the god's anger by going deep into the city, where he took the black book of the dead from its holy resting place.
His punishment is similar.
Thy father condemned me to the nameless death.
He was condemned to endure the home die, the worst of all ancient curses.
In the 1932 film, Imhotep's features inexplicably become more human, while in the 1999 film, he must absorb his victims to attain his previous form. Imhotep uses the pseudonym
Ardeth Bay,
while in the 1999 film, that is the name of the Magi warrior looking to stop their expedition. Imhotep is initially more corpse-like and has few wrappings. He isn't slow-moving, but in a fun reversal, a human walks slowly with his arms stretched out after losing his glasses. Later, we see the more classic mummies emerge. Then in 2017, Universal attempted a third success with another film simply known as The Mummy. While there have been female mummies before, this was arguably the first time one has been called a monster.
Amenet was reborn. A monster.
Princess Amenet, like both Imhoteps, makes an unholy pact with Set, and of course,
For her sins, Amenet was mummified, alive.
Years later, two looters...
We are not looters. We are liberators of precious antiquities.
That's called stealing, you know.
uncover her tomb and she is released. Also, like the two Imhoteps, she is initially grotesque and takes on a more human form. Amenet is covered in tattoos and has split irises for reasons. She wears wrappings, but they are subtle, and her image is clearly trying to avoid the stereotypical mummy. However, in the end, Tom Cruise has his hands and face wrapped. A possible wink at the idea. Who knows when the mummy will arise from the grave again and how they'll look. But most people will always imagine an undead Egyptian cursed to walk with his arms outstretched and covered in bandages. If you like this video and think we deserve it,
apparently, he had a very good time.
Please subscribe. A huge thank you to our Patreon supporters who help make these videos possible. As always, keep coming back for more spooktacular videos. I'm Heidi from Channeling Spirits, and thanks for watching. Also, I thought this said it was drained out by gravy.